to go. So as Andrew said, what I'll be talking about specifically is managing risk around compliance and technology. Now, I'm not going to be prescriptive. The temptation is to start sort of delving into particular compliance solutions or particular compliance. I'm going to try and keep it fairly generic, and really what I'm going to be focusing on is some of the key attributes and the considerations that you need to take into account when considering any system for managing risk, and we'll sort of walk through that. Before we actually go through some of those attributes though, I'd like to work through, I guess, some principles or some understandings which sort of overlay, I guess, some of those considerations. So the first piece is why compliance, why focus on compliance? At the end of the day, everything we do comes down to a handful of numbers. It's a handful of numbers that go to the regulator, they go to the CEO, to the CFO, to your board, they feed their way into your statutory accounts, they feed their way to shareholders and to the broader market in general. Ultimately, you want to make sure you get that right. So you want to make sure that all the risk management procedures around those are effective. The second piece is technology the answer? So a lot of people say, if we put a particular solution in place, will that solve all my problems? It's important to understand technology ultimately is an enabler, it's a tool, it's not a solution. There's a bigger picture, there's processes, there's governance, there's data integrity, having the right structure and so on. But the technology piece is actually quite an important piece in all of that, and that's what we'll be focusing on today, but always remember it's actually part of a much bigger picture. The third piece is, and it's one of the things that we're often faced with, is people will say, but we're really happy with what we have in place. We don't really need to change anything. When you delve in a little bit, it becomes fairly scary because in the vast majority of cases, people still use Excel to manage everything and to be in control of everything. And yet the tax office will always come back and tell you that people that manage things through Excel inevitably will make mistakes, as will some of the things that led into Sarbanes-Oxley and other initiatives. The other side of the coin, even if you do have systems in place, things change. The conversations I had with clients 20 years ago is different to 10 years ago, and indeed they're different 2 years ago, and I know in 2 years' time I'll be having different conversations again. The world's evolving, so you should always be reviewing what you're doing just to see it's current and just to see whether there's a little bit more that you can do. The next one's always the doozy. People look at the various solutions and they say, but it doesn't do things the way we do things, so we don't want to look at it. Ultimately, it's not actually intended to do that. If all you're wanting to do is replace a system to do things the same way as you did it before, then why do it at all? Ultimately, what you're doing is looking for a better solution, a way of actually doing things better, being more effective, and reducing your risk to get the right answer at the end of the day. So the moment you start hearing yourself saying it doesn't do things the way we do things, you need to ask yourself the question, are we doing things the right way? Ultimately, your risk management framework around compliance is now actually no longer an internal issue either. So we talk about the risk differentiation framework. Sorry, I put risk management framework in the slides. I suppose I should bring those up to date. The ATO factors in a whole bunch of things that feed into your risk profile, and one of those is the effectiveness of your processes and your systems. So it actually, and that has a whole bunch of repercussions in terms of the level of activity and interaction you're required to have with the ATO and the amount of effort and work you need to put into it. Just to make things a little bit more interesting, many of you may not be aware, but literally in the last month, the ATO has tabled a new initiative called self-assurance. So first we had self-assessment, then the tax differentiation framework. We're now moving to self-assurance. And the basic precept behind self-assurance is actually moving the tax office to a whole new generation or a whole new attitude where rather than passively looking for mistakes and identifying potential for issues, they're actually looking to actively encourage taxpayers to put systems in place to avoid errors in the first place. And off the back of that, there's a whole bunch of initiatives, including little or no audit activity, signing off particular financial years, and a whole bunch of other things. Now, these initiatives will evolve over the next 12 or 18 months. So what you do has a very real impact on what you do on a day-to-day basis. For those that have been through audits, I think you're all familiar with how much time and effort it actually takes to respond to those. So why not do things to actually counter it? Okay, so moving on to the attributes themselves. Obviously the key attribute is you want systems that will meet the compliance needs that you do. It's an obvious one. I'm not going to go through that in a lot of detail. What I really want to focus on is the more generic sort of attributes, and you'll see all of those listed and we'll go through those one at a time. What I'm going to do is I'll talk about the attribute, I'll talk about why it's important, and what the benefits are. So the first one's a big one. Minimise the number of systems that you have in place. Ultimately, the benefit of that is the fewer systems you have in place, the more efficient you will be, the lower the risk. There's a number of different aspects to that. The first one is the fewer systems you have in place, the easier it is to manage and control that system. So many of you would come out of organisations that have multiple ERP systems, multiple compliance systems, multiple systems that do lots of different things. Each one of those systems needs a level of expertise to support it. The fewer there are, the more you can sort of focus and control that just that little bit better. The next piece is it optimises your ability to actually leverage the work that you do. It's amazing how many organisations have different systems that effectively do different steps in the same process. The very simple one is statutory accounting to tax reporting to tax return to PAYG. It's one and the same process, and yet ultimately we often see people have different systems. Some use Excel, some use Integrator, some use a whole bunch of other different tools. And often they don't talk to each other, so they replicate and they duplicate. The more you duplicate and you replicate processes, the higher the chance that you're going to get something wrong. The harder it is to audit and trace it back, the harder it is for you to make sure that you get it right. So the fewer systems you have and the more you leverage those functions, the higher the chances that you're going to get it right. Knowledge, quality and availability. If you've got 10 people and 10 systems, you're only going to be able to train those 10 people up to a certain level. If you've got 10 people and 2 systems, you can give them far deeper knowledge and they're going to be far more effective at actually managing the output from those systems. The other side of the coin as well is how many experts and professionals can you actually afford to come in and manage your SAP system or your compliance systems. Ultimately, the fewer systems you have in place, the more you can leverage and benefit from the expertise of external advisors. From a user security perspective, people come and go, and it is not unusual for people to actually leave an organisation and people to forget to switch them off out of the system. In the old days, it probably didn't matter that much because most of the systems were in-house, so if you couldn't get in through the network, you couldn't get into the system. But in the 21st century, most systems are now online. So what you don't want is somebody who is left to actually still have access to various account and data that they're no longer entitled to have. I personally have worked with people that have actually had access to online systems 2 years down the track when they should have actually been logged out and cut out of the system. So the more systems you have in place, you've got to manage all the people coming and going. The greater the chance that you're going to miss somebody on the way through. The fewer the systems are, the easier it is to manage that security and control. In terms of project failures, if you can leverage an existing system, you're more likely to have a successful project rollout. So there's lots of statistics around the number of IT projects that actually fail. And part of the reason they fail is because for any of you that have actually been through an evaluation process, it's quite a detailed and involved process in working out the appropriateness of the system, the capability, the functionality. Ultimately, something breaks along the way. Typically, it's because the people that are running the project also have their day-to-day job to do as well, as compared to being able to leverage an existing system where it's a known quantity and all you're doing is adding functionality. So again, if you can leverage an existing system, it just means your success rate goes up and the risk diminishes. And then ultimately, the fewer systems you have and the more those systems spread over multiple functions, the more you're able to actually start leveraging some data analytics. And data analytics basically says the ability to dig through and mine your data to look for trends, to better understand your company and I guess make it easier for you to be able to pick up errors. So that's just some of the benefits of actually minimising the number of systems around that. So that's the first attribute. The second attribute is, I guess, leverage related processes and data. So I've already talked about that a little bit. The obvious one, as I said, is accounts, tax return, PAYG, tax reporting. The other ones as well is FBT, RFBA, payroll, workers' compensation. There's an awful lot of processes where the same core set of data actually feed into different reporting functions. So if you look at FBT, your FBT data actually also feeds into your reportable fringe benefits amounts, which ultimately feed into your payroll function, into your payroll returns. And yet, as we do, when we sit down with so many different clients, it's amazing how many people actually have that in different job functions using different tools. FBT is probably the poorer example. The big cousin's obviously tax reporting and tax returns. When you do an effective tax reporting, when you do your TEA at the end of the year, that should be 60 to 80% of your tax return. So why redo that on a different system? Why redo all the calculations? Why increase that chance of error? So the more you can actually identify related processes and you can tie those into a common system, the less error there will be, the more time there will be for you to be able to review and actually pick up any issues and errors on the way through. Maximise automation. I guess this one's stating the obvious. The more human intervention that's involved on the way through, the higher the chance of error. What you want to do is actually minimise that error. There have been independent studies that put transposition error rates at roughly 10%. The moment that you've actually got hands typing in formulas, that error rate goes up quite significantly. All of you would have been involved creating spreadsheets, and I'm sure many of you have created nested if statements. So how long does it take you to actually get that right, get the bracket in the right place, and how often do you miss that because you haven't actually triggered the exception that gives rise to the exception within that nested if statement? So the more you can minimise that and actually leverage a level of automation, the lower the risk, the higher the chances are that you're going to get it right. Ultimately, utopia would be not to actually have any manual intervention, but obviously that's impossible because at some point in time somebody has to enter a number. But the sweet spot is to get to a point where any particular line item or any particular data item is only ever touched once. That's utopia. You ever touch once and everything after that is automated. That's where you want to get to. Okay, this one's a big one. Minimise the reliance of Microsoft Excel. So Excel is the beloved tool in tax, accounting, finance. And yet, when you look at Microsoft Excel, it's also one of the biggest source of errors. I have that statement up there that talked about, did Excel cause the GFC? About a year and a half ago, there was a whole series of articles that talked about somebody making a calculational error in a spreadsheet, which worked out the wrong trigger point for the banks to start recalling all their bank loans. That trigger point came in too early. The banks started recalling their loans a little bit too early, and that's what triggered the GFC. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I don't know, but that was the speculation that actually came through in all of these articles. The reality is that spreadsheets are fun. I actually even designed a house on Excel once. But the reality is that Excel is fraught with errors. If you've ever reviewed spreadsheets, it is actually quite rare to find one that actually is correct. You find things wrong in the formulas. You find people actually embedding numbers in their formulas, and of course the next person comes along and forgets the numbers there and perpetuates that error on the way through. The issues involved with spreadsheets has been recognised by many authorities. It's been embedded in Sarbanes-Oxley. They've even brought out a whole discipline around SAS 70 and subsequent updates to those rules in terms of how you control and try and get some level of integrity from spreadsheets. The ATO, most recently, part of the initiative behind self-assurance is around indirect tax. They got to the point where they said because people use Excel so much, the risk of error is inevitable, not because people want to make mistakes, but they will just because of the tools and the systems that they use in place. The interesting part is that when you sit down and you talk to CFOs and to tax managers and to accountants and to finance people, the first half of the conversation is always, look at my great spreadsheets. We do all these wonderful things, both for Australia and all over the world. And then as things quieten down, but everybody recognises the risks that are involved with that. So actually everybody knows the risks that are tied in with spreadsheets, but for whatever reason, people don't take the next step to move away from them. Now, ultimately, spreadsheets will always be there. There will always be things that you will do on spreadsheets. But if you're working in a large multinational or national organisation, spreadsheets should not be the backbone of all your reporting and compliance. So it should be in the peripheral. One of the trigger points for spreadsheets, I guess, is the key person dependency. So over the many years, I've been involved, I guess, in the system and specifically in tax systems since the 90s. And the conversation that sort of says, I love my spreadsheets, we're happy to run with this. And then suddenly a desperate call when the person who actually owns the spreadsheet leaves. So the thing to always remember about spreadsheets, and particularly the really big model, is you've got a really huge key person dependency issue. What happens when the person who has managed and built in all these complex formulas and then built layers upon layers of complexity leaves your organisation? I've been designing and building spreadsheets for many years and I think I'm pretty good at it. But the reality is whenever I go back and look at the spreadsheet, the next person comes along, no matter how simple it is, they don't understand. So they pick up and they create yet another spreadsheet. So that's one of the other big issues around Excel. There's other impacts as well in terms of version control and, of course, the negative impact it has on your risk rating. All right. The next one is your ability to view, audit, and trace the source of your data. So there's a number of different aspects to this. It's the ability to be able to trace your disclosures back to your source data. It's your ability to trace the results of a calculation back to its constituent parts. They're the obvious ones. The ones that are a little bit less obvious are your ability to actually trace the reason you have applied a particular treatment. Do you have the notes and the query sheets and the comments that actually support a particular treatment and a particular number that appears in your tax return, for example? Or if a particular treatment is based on a letter of advice, how easy is it to actually find that letter of advice and actually reference that? So when you're looking at systems from a risk management perspective, anything that allows you to tie all of that together, anything that allows you to be able to drill down on a number and look back to where it comes from, anything that allows you to double click on a comment and read why somebody treated it the way they did is going to aid you in your risk management process. The other type of audit trail is the actual audit trail as well. So if something actually goes wrong, the ability to trace who did what, when did somebody actually go in and change a critical number that gave an incorrect result. So they're all the different aspects of an audit trail. So critical from a risk management perspective is actually for you to address all those different aspects to be able to audit and trace through your data. All right. Just some other smaller tidbits. Workflow. The world's getting more complex, not less. As many of you will know, the world today in terms of your reporting is far more onerous in terms of what you need to do. 15, 20 years ago, we didn't have GST. We didn't have monthly PAYG instalments. We didn't have monthly tax reporting or quarterly reporting. It used to be a once-a-year process. Generally, most things were national. We might have had some international exposure, but now we've got a lot of international exposure. We used to have a small number of entities. Now we have actually large organisations with people spread all over the country and in many cases all over the globe that we need to manage. Some kind of workflow tool that you can access that allows you to view where things are and the status of your activity is actually quite important just to make sure things don't fall through the cracks. It's quite a critical tool when you're looking at it from a risk management perspective. The next item is security. Whatever system you select needs to have an effective security system. Ultimately, this is the backbone that controls who can do what. What you want to do is to be able to give people access and authority that aligns with their capability and the authority levels that they have. When you look at the systems today, particularly the ones that are hosted, you're going to have people accessing it from all over the world. You want to be able to have a system that will actually allow you to control what they see, what they do, and what they control. The next item we touched on a little bit earlier, which was data analysis. Ultimately, the more analysis that you can do, the better understanding you have of your organisation, the higher the chance you'll pick up discrepancies and errors. So when we talk about data analysis, it's simple things like comparing this year to last year. So when you're think about your tax return, one of your review steps is actually picking up your numbers today, comparing it to last year and investigating any major changes or anything new or anything that's missing. Looking at trends, just looking for new things, looking for something that sticks out. So any tool that gives you that capability is a plus from a risk management perspective. Configurability and customization. Why is that important in terms of systems? Customization basically refers to a situation where somebody comes to you and says, we have a system, we need to build or program changes to the system to meet your particular needs. Configuration basically talks about a system that says it's out of the box, but we give you lots of options to be able to cut and dice it in different ways to meet your needs. Whilst they actually sound the same from a risk management perspective, over the medium to long term, they actually have very different outcomes. From a customisation perspective, in year one, you might get exactly what you want. But invariably, customisation is very, very expensive. Why that becomes important is because in year two, you need to reach into your pocket. And then in year three, you need to do the same. Invariably, what ends up happening is, sorry, we don't have budget. The moment you don't have budget, you start putting workarounds in place, typically Excel. As time goes on, those workarounds become bigger and bigger. Ultimately, you undermine the benefit of the system. Configuration moves away from that that problem, just fundamentally because you can actually change the configuration as you go without requiring expensive customizable programming changes to that software. So that's also a consideration. Last 2 points, I'm just conscious of drinks coming through at 5:30. Cloud or vendor hosted versus deployed on site, and in-house versus vendor development. So looking at cloud and vendor hosted solutions versus deploying solutions on site. So there's a lot of pros and cons, I guess, that we could talk about in terms of actually deploying a solution in-house versus externally. But from a risk management perspective and an effectiveness perspective, provided that you validated the vendor's ability to protect your data, there are huge benefits in actually having a vendor-hosted solution versus running it in-house. And it really sort of comes down to one basic principle. When a vendor sells a particular solution, whoever that vendor may be, that's what they do day in, day out. So after a period of time, they become very good at it. They know what works, what doesn't work, they know how to address problems, and they can do it fairly quickly. When you bring something in-house, even if you deploy it to the web as you can externally, the reality is there's probably one program amongst 100 that your IT group has to manage. They may look at it once, twice, say 3 times a year. Every time they come back to it, it's a new program effectively. They'll strike hurdles, they may get it wrong, it may disrupt you, you may not get the result that you want. We have many situations with clients where it's internally hosted, where by the time their internal IT is actually ready to roll it out and actually get it right, time has elapsed. They may not get the benefits that they need early enough. So that's probably the key consideration so far as hosted versus deploying it internally. That's without sort of getting into other discussions around collaborative use and other benefits of hosted solutions. And finally, the other one was, we often have a conversation with clients that says, we're considering building our solutions in-house as distinct from buying something externally. Developing stuff internally always sounds very attractive. The reality is that in most cases, when it comes to compliance, it's actually quite complex. Given my background in both tax and IT, I work, I guess, at the edge of tax, which is probably the fastest changing legal area, and technology, which just never stands still. When you're developing something in-house, you're actually bringing those two components internally and expecting that your IT people will be able to keep up and manage that. So ultimately, really, it's a question of scale and your ability to actually not only build but maintain it. The benefit of going with a vendor solution ultimately is, again, if it's all the vendor does, that's where they're focused. They throw all their expertise and background at it. They'll make sure that it's up to date, and it's part of, I guess, their being alive to keep that up to date and keep you up and running. So that's my session on compliance. Any questions? And unusually for a Greek, I'm spot on time. Thanks very much. Okay.